How are you doing? This video has been a real marathon. If you appreciate the videos, you can help by smashing the like button in the first 40 seconds. The YouTube algorithm likes that. The other ways to help are to subscribe if you're not already and hit the bell to be informed of new videos. You can also ask questions or make comments, even if it's just first. And you can share the videos. The first act of resistance against the German occupation could be said to be de Gaulle's call of the 18th of June. He'd left France when Pétain capitulated, and he persuaded Churchill to allow him to do this call over the BBC, and he incited the French people to continue the combat and that any French that were in England to join him to make a free French army. He actually had 25,000 members. In France, the population were in shock after this incomprehensible defeat. The French army and the British Expeditionary Force largely outnumbered the German tanks. Pétain's government was installed in Vichy in the south of France. They controlled the south of France in collaboration with the Germans, and the Germans occupied and controlled the north of France. Individuals who didn't want to accept the German occupation were impotent against this well-equipped and organised army. Some made gestures like attacking a motorcyclist with a slingshot or making roadblocks. Etienne Acheverry was the first Frenchman to be shot for sabotage, cutting telephone lines in July 1940. The complexity of organising hiding places and passing the British soldiers led to the formation of the first escape networks. John Moulin was to become a great figure of the French resistance. He was a prefect at Chartres. Now, a prefect is a high-ranking regional civil servant. Now, he was ordered by 3 German officers to sign a declaration accusing French, Senegalese black soldiers of having committed an atrocity actually committed by the Germans. He refused, so he was put in prison. Now, he tried to cut his throat using a piece of glass he found. He didn't succeed, but he was released from prison. That's why he always had a scarf after that to hide the scar. The non-organised resistance is often called passive resistance, but it wasn't always so passive. Information notices were torn down, graffiti was put on walls, there were cartoons with a picture of Hitler and a caption saying, "Have you beaten England yet?" In cinemas with newsreels, the people would boo victorious German troops, and the film of the 1938 World Cup was shown between Switzerland and Germany, and the people would cheer for the Swiss goals and silence for the Germans. So cinemas were closed, but then they were reopened and films were shown with the lights up. The BBC launched a V battle. They suggested people put V's up wherever they could. So V's appeared on walls, on the pavements, on German cars. The Germans got unemployed to clean them off, and the next day there was hundreds more. So then the Germans put swastikas in the middle of the V, and the people turned that into a cross of Lorraine. Now, the Germans didn't know what the cross of Lorraine represented at the time. Here in Place Foch in Caen, behind me was the Hotel Malherbe for the war, and the Germans took it over and it became the headquarters of the Feld Gendarmerie. After the war it became Hotel Holiday Inn, and now it's been turned into offices. And just opposite the Feld Kommandatur, in the middle of the square, was this monument, which is the World War I monument. Now, de Gaulle had encouraged the people to celebrate the 11th of November. They didn't need much encouragement. So on 11th of November 1940, there was a big ceremony here, over 150 people. The women were all dressed in red, white and blue, and the men had a red, white and blue cockade in their hat. And the Germans didn't do anything about the ceremony directly, but the next week a train was derailed and 10 people that were at the ceremony disappeared, probably to concentration camps. And not much of Caen survived. The chateau was actually hidden by houses. They've all disappeared due to the bombing. All those buildings over there are post-war. This one survived, 14th century timber frame house. And then between here and the Abbey aux Hommes, quite a bit of that survived. But there past St. Peter's Church, all that has been rebuilt. Now this house called Catron is in Rue Jail, or Jail Street. And it was down here that Todd made all the bunkers along the Atlantic Wall. They had their headquarters. And there was a painter, Duché. He saw a sign up asking for quotes to do the decoration in Todd's offices. Now the date limit had passed, but he went to see the officer in command and he gave such a low quote, they took him on to do the job. So he was working in the offices. When the officer in charge wasn't looking, he picked up a map off of his desk and put it behind a mirror on the wall. Then when he finished working, he rolled up the map with all his wallpaper samples and walked out with it. And it was a map of all the gun batteries along the coast. Now Duce's colleagues said to him, "You take too many risks." He said, "You have to keep a cool head." And finally the Gestapo got onto him. They went to his house to arrest him, but he wasn't there. There was just an irate customer bawling out his wife about some shoddy work he'd done. So they let the customer go home and they took his wife away. And the customer was actually Duché. So he got away again. The gendarmes were officially working for the Germans, but many were part of the resistance. John Hopper was a resistant who had shot the police inspector. There was a manhunt on for him. 3 inspectors, Deteville, Coste and Fribourg, were sent from Rouen to Caen. They were actually in the same organisation as Hopper. On the 5th of August, a message came in that Hopper had been seen near St. Sauveur. The 3 police resistants were in a car with a Gestapo agent and another car with police from Caen were to trap him in a pincer movement. How could they save him without the others realising what they're up to? The streets of Caen were narrower than they are now. Coste was driving and managed to hook the fender on a passing car. Fremont leaves the crowd that forms to go towards where Hopper had been seen. He made signs to Hopper, who quickly disappeared. When an Allied airman was shot down near St. Sauveur on Calvados, over 1,000 people were in the funeral cortege. His grave was one mountain of flowers. In January of 1943, a Canadian pilot, William Ferguson, was attacking the railway line near Baya, and he didn't pull out of a dive and crashed near Damigny. He was probably hit by flak. He was buried at St. Martin-des-Entrées. There was a large crowd of civilians gathered to pay homage to Ferguson. Flowers were piled on his grave. As the crowd left the cemetery, they were stopped at the gate by German soldiers. Their papers were confiscated, and a week later, 10 people were taken away to a concentration camp. In April 1941, 2 men, Denis Boudard and Jean Hébert, they went into Carpiquet Airfield, which is near Caen, because it was a German airfield at the time, and they stole a German plane. Now they took off with it and flew to England. They were lucky they weren't shot down arriving in a German plane in England, but they managed to land at Chichester Airfield. And they were given felicitations by de Gaulle and Churchill. Denis Boudard was actually flying over Normandy on D-Day in a Spitfire, and he was the first Allied pilot to land in Carpiquet Airfield after it was liberated by the Canadians. Louis Alley was a police inspector before the war. Being a fervent anti-communist, with the Germans in control, he felt that they'd be able to crack down on these communist agitators. Now the police department was getting criticised by the German authorities for not being effective enough. So Louis Alley suggested to his superior that he contact the Feld Gendarmerie directly to work with them. And that's how he became one of the most infamous leaders of the anti-terrorist brigade. The organised movements were forming in France. They were independent and often isolated. They weren't sure what they were going to do, but they knew they had to act together. The British Secret Service and the French Secret Service of the Free French in the UK, they needed to know what was happening in France, where the divisions were, with how many men, where were the airfields. So they sent in agents to set up networks. The brothers Raoul and Henri Boulanger had a farm near Ries, near Rouen. Raoul had some tricks for sabotage, which were apparently without any cause. He would make a tube with lighter flints in it, separated from some acid by an absorbent plug. And they dropped that into the fuel tank of a German truck while the driver was in a bar. And then a few miles up the road, the fuel tank would explode. Another trick he had was to put carborundum in oil drums destined for the Wehrmacht. Raoul Boulanger was to become Fantomas, or the leader of the Black Devils. When Raoul was in the army, he would often go absent, and at the farm, they dug a tunnel from the house underground behind a cupboard so he could hide. Now, with the war starting and lots of refugees and clandestine men, they wanted to make this tunnel much bigger. So they dug and dug, and they joined it up to a well, or a marnière. That's a hole in the ground where you get milestones out. And in the end, after months of work, they had a dormitory and an arms stash. They had 2 entrances from the house and 2 entrances into marnières, or wells. One morning, after a busy night collecting an arms drop, his sister-in-law woke him up roughly. She said, "The police and the Krauts are here." He looked out the window, he could see the courtyard full of German soldiers and police. So he got dressed as quick as he could. He went up to the loft and he put a wounded comrade into a special sack they had, lowered him right down through a trapdoor in the ground floor, and then he pulled the lever, the trapdoor closed, and a sack of potatoes spilled over the trapdoor. Louis Ali was there with his men searching everything. Raoul said, "What are you looking for now?" Nobody answered. And then after a bit, Louis Ali said, "We're looking for refractors from the obligatory work service." And Henry wasn't so calm. He was worried that perhaps in their haste of getting all the arms they'd collected, somebody might have left some ammunition lying around. But then Raoul said to Ali, "Where do you think they could be? Down the well?" And Ali got a German soldier to go down on the rope, down the well. Henry nearly had a heart attack. But the German soldier came up pretty quickly. He was white as a sheet. He said, "No, there's nothing down there except dead animals." So the Germans went away. A vital element of the network was the radio. The radio operator had to send messages and receive them from London. They were sent in Morse and in code, and they were coded elsewhere, so the radio operator didn't know what the message was normally. They had to follow strict rules while they were operating. They shouldn't emit for more than 10 minutes, and they had to change place frequently. Now, the Germans had a system to find the radios. There was a listening centre at Nantes in France,
Hamburg,
and Munich in Germany. And by triangulation, they'd narrow down the area where the radio was to a 20-kilometre diameter. And then they'd have a van with an antenna on top going around to find the radio. So if they emitted from the same place more than once, they had a good chance of getting caught the second time. There were normally 2 other members of the radio team. There was a protector, because the radio operator couldn't spend time looking around to see if anybody was coming. So he was a lookout. And then there was the liaison. He would take the messages to the network. The radio operator would live separate from all the others. But even so, 75% of them were caught and shot. Radio communications didn't suffice for everything. People had to be brought in and taken out, and packages had to come in and out as well. Now, for people to come in, they could be parachuted in if they had training, but the only way out was by plane or by boat. The Westland Lysander was an exceptional plane for these missions. It could land in an unprepared small field. It wasn't only people and packages that were brought in or out by the Lysander. In the Boulanger group, one of the members contracted diphtheria, and they couldn't get the serum from a doctor or a hospital. They sent a message to London, and the next evening a Lysander came over and dropped a package of serum so they could treat all the men. Now, Robert Leblanc was in the Navy before the war, but forced to leave due to ill health. So he came to Saint-Étienne-l'Allier and set up a cafe and grocery store. Now, when the war started in 1940, he wanted to join the army, but they wouldn't take him because of his past ill health. But he was actually destined to become the leader of one of the most famous macki in Normandy, Macki Soukouf. In 1940, he met Robert Sampson, alias Le Torpille, and Father Mullen. Leblanc's job was to find hideouts for refugees and escaped POWs. This building behind me is the cafe grocery shop of Robert Leblanc. Now, in 1942, the obligatory work service was started, and Robert Leblanc was at the station at Pont-Audemer. He saw a group of about 20 young men. He asked them where they were going. They said Germany to work. So he said, well, come with me. Now, only two of them dared disobey the orders from Vichy, but the two of them went with Leblanc, so he had to hide them, and that was the birth of the Macki Soukouf. The gendarmes were officially working for the Germans, but many were in the resistance. All 4 gendarmes at Saint-Georges-du-Vièvre were resistance, including the commander. They would help vet new recruits and give training with weapons. They would warn the resistance if there was a search on, or lead the Gestapo to the wrong place. But sometimes they had to arrest resistance. They were finally denounced and arrested. They were in a train leaving Paris for Buchenwald. The Swedish consul, Nordlin, who convinced von Cholditz not to destroy Paris, managed to stop the train leaving. But the Gestapo overruled the Wehrmacht and they ended up at Buchenwald. Resistance had to be jack of all trades, but they usually had a special assignment they had to accomplish. Flavien Foyer, his job was to carry messages to other groups. He would also forage for food for the maquisards, often blackening his face in his nighttime exploits. On the 12th of January 1944, Flavien, William and Jean Le Polonais, that means the Polish guy, were denounced and taken to Pont-Audemer to be interrogated by Louis Allais. The gendarmes told Leblanc. He organised a scheme using 2 Alsatian deserters to dress as Feld gendarmes and go and get them. The Guardians didn't suspect these men talking perfect German and opened the doors of the cells. Now, on the 20th of January 1944, a large group of militia was seen coming towards Saint-Hélier, and they were being led by Derve, the verger of the church here. They had the mission. Time for Vepr. Now, they had the militia in their sights, but in January 1944 they didn't have much weapons, and in the group of these militia were the 2 gendarmes who were their colleagues, so they didn't really want to fire on them anyway, so they disappeared into the undergrowth. But after getting clearance from London, they decided to judge and execute Derve, the verger. So on the 24th of January, the villagers woke up to find him hanging from the spire of the church. I've already mentioned Louis Allais, and also the habit that the French had of I've mentioned Louis Allais before, and also the fact that the French took great joy in celebrating the 14th of July, just to annoy the Germans. But on the 14th of July 1944, the civilians at Pont-Audemer had been having a celebration. Louis Allais actually got the men to machine gun them. Then he came to Saint-Étienne-de-l'Allier and he was going to do the same thing. He actually wanted Robert Leblanc, He thought he ran the shop. He hadn't been there for a long time. He had a manager in to do it. So he lined up all the civilians. He did shoot the manager of the shop and the priest, but he didn't shoot the other civilians. On these wooded slopes near Saint-Georges-de-Vièvre, there was a farm called Le Pilvillière, which was well hidden. It was only visible from the air, and so it was used as one of their bases. Now the maquisards were normally spread out in different hideouts, but they felt that the Pilvillière was so safe that sometimes there was up to 150 men there. They often had parachute drops coming in a field near it, and on the 5th of June they were expecting a parachute drop, but they were surprised to hear some Stukas diving down and drop bombs on them. Nobody was badly hurt, but it was obvious that the Germans knew where they were, and so they moved to another hideout they had along a path which you could only go along by foot. You couldn't go along it by vehicle, and that was the Le Coq farm. A few days after the bombing, the Germans went to the Pilvillière to search it, and probably due to the bombing they saw a cable that had been buried, so they followed the cable and it led them to the Le Coq farm. And before they got there, all the maquisards had gone, but they decided to destroy the farm. They set fire to it, and nothing of it remains today. Now on this hill near Saint-Georges-de-Vièvre, the Germans have built a watchtower in the woods here. The hill is 191 metres, that's over 600 feet. And from the top of the watchtower, they could see right to the estuary of the River Seine and Le Havre, which is over that way. Now before D-Day, the macki blew it up, and the Germans just rebuilt it. And then on the 6th of June, D-Day was on, and the macki were told by codes. The first message they got was the dice are cast, and then the second message on June the 5th, they said it's hot in Suez. So that was their message to say that D-Day was on. So they realised that this had to be blown up again, because the Germans were connected by telephone to the guns on the coast, and they could direct the gunfire onto the ships. And so in broad daylight they attacked it. They were fired on by the Germans. Some of the macki fired back at the Germans, while others made a detour, managed to put the explosives on the feet of the watchtower and blew the whole thing up in full daylight. And just by this crossroads there was a sawmill owned by Robert Boulon. They often use these tools for cutting trunks and splitting them. And on the 6th of June, lots of things happened on the 6th of June. Leblanc and some of his men were passing by, and Robert Boulon invited them in for a drink. And just at that time, a Mercedes came along with some German officers in, so they opened fire on it, and all the German officers were killed. Now on the 8th, the car was still there, and they were once again at Robert Boulon's sawmill having a drink. And because the Germans were looking for whoever did this attack, a patrol came along to the sawmill, so a firefight broke out, and some Germans were killed. The macki disappeared because Robert Boulon and his nephew were still there. They were shot by the Germans and their bodies left on the road. During the war, that was the Hotel of France. And yet another thing happened on the 6th of June. On the 6th of June, it was all-out war here. Leblanc heard there were 11 Germans in there getting ready to go and reinforce the front. And so, of course, he attacked it. They were even fighting inside the hotel. One of the Germans escaped because he'd gone to the hairdressers, but 10 of them were killed. On the 8th of June 1944, Flavien was part of a sawing party to saw up logs to make roadblocks. He was in a hurry to get home because it was his 3rd wedding anniversary. As soon as he got home, somebody was there to give him a message to take to Leblanc. He wasn't very enthusiastic about going, but his wife convinced him, so he went off to take the message to Robert Leblanc. He's on his way back through the village, which is behind us there, coming down this road. As he went through the village, the people tried to shout to him not to take this road and go another way, because he knew that Louis Ali was in the region. But he came down here. He passed some German soldiers along the road, no problem, so he thought everything's okay. But he got to this bend here and he was machine gunned. There was an ambush by the Gestapo. Now, he didn't die immediately, but the Germans stopped the doctor going to treat him. So he died here and he was buried here before being moved. Another famous resistant was Guillaume Mercader. After being demobbed in 1940, he looked after his cycle shop in Baya. Being a professional cyclist, he had permission to train, so could ride around getting information. His shop was where Key West is now. He organised the visit of de Gaulle to Baya on the 14th of June, just after D-Day. De Gaulle strode up the main street, being acclaimed by the crowd. Then they came down the Rue du General D-Day, and they got to the Place du Château, and the sub-prefecture was the other side. And it was there that de Gaulle set up a provisional government. So Baya was the capital of Free France for a few weeks. Then they came back to the Place du Château, and under these trees, which was protected from any eventual bombing by the Germans, he made a speech to the populace here. This visit of de Gaulle to Baya decided the Allies that they didn't have to make an amgot, and that de Gaulle was actually capable of forming a government. This is the 12th of August 1944. We're in Bois de l'Evêque, which is near Montreuil, south of Normandy. Since the 13th of June, André Mazarin was the head of the resistance in the department of Orne, or the county of Orne. They set up their headquarters in this Bishop's Wood here, or Bois de l'Evêque. This forested area was a great place to hide out from the Germans. I say the resistance because by now most of the networks and movements were working together. Mazarin had a mission, which was to meet an officer of the SAS, Lieutenant Anderson. Mazarin and Savary went down the D16 through Montmary and then through Montreuil with no problems. And they came around a bend and they suddenly came into a horde of German soldiers. They were stopped. A German soldier asked them what they were doing, and they said, "Oh, we're going to look for potatoes in the plain to supply a youth camp." The Germans said, "You can't go down that road. You kaput. There's Americans in Say." They tried to look disappointed, but they were actually overjoyed. So they turned round and went up the road. Now, as they knew the terrain like the back of their hands, they used the little lanes get past the Germans to get into Say. They came into the outskirts of Say and they saw two small tanks, and there was an American officer stood up in a jeep looking into the distance with binoculars. So Mazarin explained what he wanted and the American didn't take any notice. So they carried on into town. And one of the first people to rally to de Gaulle was a certain Philippe Auticloc. He was sent by de Gaulle to West Africa to rally the French colonies to the Free French cause. Now, as he had family in Normandy, he actually changed his name to Leclerc. Now, he came into Normandy leading the French 2nd Armour Division on the 1st of August through Utah Beach. They joined him with Patton's 3rd Army, and just 12 days afterwards, they were 150 miles from Utah Beach. As they approached the town centre, they saw some Shermans with crosses of Lorraine on them and a bearded officer with a kepi. They were French soldiers. The officer introduced himself as Captain Drone and said, "Follow me," and he took him to go and see the general. Now, Leclerc was sat on a chair behind a scout car with a map on his knees. Leclerc plied him with questions. How many men did he have? Where were they? What weapons did they have? Leclerc wanted to sweep up to Écouché, which is west of Argenton, and he was going to use the maquisards to protect his left flank. He said, "Be at the western exit in 2 hours, and use your men to clear the woods. Leclerc wasn't supposed to go through Say. It was the Americans' route. He decided to go there instead of going through the Excludes forest to gain time. This caused an enormous traffic jam. Some elements of the 2nd EB had gone through the forest and came up against the 5th Panzers around the cross of Medevy. As Leclerc moved towards Écouché, he sent Colonel Putz from the north of the forest to take the Germans in the rear. For his actions against the Germans in the Excludes forest, Leclerc was praised by General Hayslip. This tank got hit by an anti-tank shell on the barrel. Mazarin was guiding Group Banny, and apart from coming up against the German convoy at Bousset, which they destroyed, Mazarin used a Tommy gun in that attack. They arrived near Écouché on the evening of the 12th, and they went in on the morning of the 13th at 7:30 to liberate Écouché. This video has been a real marathon, over 400 miles of driving, a day for filming Leclerc, a day for Soukouf, and then Caen and Bayeux, and then all the indoor stuff. I've got a lot out, but I still haven't mentioned sheltering Jewish families and how many were in the resistance. That would be another video, but I'll put numbers in the description. I've got to close now. Would appreciate smashing the like button and subscribing if you're not already subscribed. I must mention a landmark event, even though it didn't happen in Normandy. I mentioned John Moulin before. He became de Gaulle's man in France to get all the different organisations to work together. He organised a meeting in a doctor's house in Lyon, that was in the Free France, down south. The men arrived and the doctor's secretary showed them into the waiting room. And then suddenly the Gestapo burst in. They'd been betrayed by a member who'd been arrested a few days earlier. They were taken to be interrogated by KLaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon. Now, if you don't know him, you look him up, and there's some links in the description for books. One man arrested was Raymond Ruffin. Now, his girlfriend, Lucy Aubrac, she actually went into the lion's den to see KLaus Barbie to ask for a favour. Now, there was a law in France at the time, a condemned man could get married. So she convinced KLaus Barbie to let them get married. So Raymond was taken by a truck to the ceremony, and on the way back, Lucy Aubrac and some other men attacked the truck and freed Raymond. Now, Raymond and Lucy both survived the war. They died a few years ago. Now, John Moulin didn't have the same fortune. He was interrogated and tortured by KLaus Barbie, and then he was put in a train for Germany, and he died in the train.